Today I have with me João Ribeiro, who is the head of UNCITRAL, the regional office in Asia and Pacific. João, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what the role of UNCITRAL is going to be as we move forward with the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular how it's going to help with their implementation.
Well, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, if approved by the end of the year, are quite an ambitious agenda, and no political program, no government will be able to ignore it in the coming 15 years. But it's true that no government will be able to ignore it, but at the same time it will be impossible only for governments to implement them. So a strong participation of the private sector, of businesses, will be very important for the implementation of those goals. So what we do is that we provide for legislative frameworks, for laws and rules that help frame business-to-business relationship, contractual relationship, and cross-border relationships. So we provide that rule-based trade that allows for especially entrepreneurs and businesses from developing countries to have access to a leveled playing field of contractual business relationships.
This must be very appropriate in the Asia-Pacific region today with the explosion of the economies there. So how do you see UNCITRAL playing a role in the region?
Yes, we can see that the numbers, the economic numbers in the region are staggering. The number of the GDP growth is incredible. The need for cross-border trade is growing. We are witnessing a strong movement of economic emancipation. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises account in almost the whole region for more than 2/3 of the national economies. So we can see that at the same time, because of the financial crisis, cross-border trade will allow most of the economies in the region to better face this crisis when they have their economy sustained on cross-border trade and beyond commodities trade. So there will be a need for more cross-border trade, and for this to be a fair game for developing countries' businesses, we need to have laws in place that can provide for access to justice, so businesses know that if there is a dispute arising from their contract, they can have access to international commercial arbitration. They need to have basic understanding and common understanding of what is a sale of goods, so we need to have good contractual law reforms that can allow for the same approach on what is a contract on the sale of goods, and that's not even something that is agreed throughout the world. And e-commerce, electronic commerce, again, we provide for good standards to regulate electronic commerce, to ensure that people can trust the system, that it's reliable, that it's enforceable, and that the system works. So we provide these standards that allow for businesses to engage in cross-border trade, reducing transaction costs, trusting the system, and as I mentioned before, leveling the playing field. SMEs do not have access to highly qualified legal advice. They do not have legal departments as the big corporations have, or as even many SMEs in developed economies. So if the legal system is predictable, is familiar to them, it will be easier for them to engage in trade in a safer way, and at the same time reducing costs, because of course if the risks of this cross-border trade are very high, companies tend to incorporate those risks in the cost of the transaction. So if we reduce those risks, and if we reduce it considerably, that of course will also result in reducing transaction costs, and therefore fostering trade and also ensuring a better redistribution of wealth.
So in that respect, it will be dealing with inequalities?
Absolutely. I think it's a matter of fact now that we know that trade, cross-border trade, world trade, has been a fundamental contribution, has delivered a fundamental contribution to reduce inequalities, to raise standards of living, to allow for economic emancipation, especially in groups that face huge challenges, women, for instance, young people. If you have a rule-based system, people can use those rules to emancipate economically, and if those rules are international standards, it will be easier for them to act following the rules and not be subject to factual powers that sometimes thrive when there are no rules in place.
You mentioned earlier e-commerce, and obviously this is a booming field and impacting all countries across the world. Tell me about UNCITRAL's work there.
Well, without going into much detail, until very recently, and still in many economies, people only trust trade if they have a paper with them. They don't trust the legal validity of an email making a contract. So a business in one developing country with a business in one developed economy, they can actually exchange emails and agree on a contract. What our texts provide is this functional equivalence, which means that following our standards and adopting our model on e-commerce or adopting the Electronic Communications Convention, this electronic exchange by email is functionally equivalent to the more traditional paper exchange, contractual exchange. So with this legal framework, again, we provide trust, and states can provide trust for their businesses to engage into electronic commerce. And this has a huge effect in developing economies, because I know of many cases of small entrepreneurs which sometimes are just doing art crafts and can sell their art crafts online to shops in New York or Paris, and they just do this through exchange of emails. So our legal framework allows these businesses to expand their markets and go beyond their natural markets because they can easily rely on the legal system to do so.